Tucked away in a quiet corner of Montana, near the vast reaches of Glacier National Park, a solitary man stumbles upon an injured black bear, its fur matted with blood, its eyes brimming with silent pain. In a moment of reckless compassion, he decides to nurse the wild creature back to health under his humble roof. Yet, as fragile trust replaces the initial fear, neither man nor bear can begin to imagine the bond that will form between them. And on one life-changing day, long after the bear vanishes into the woods, it reappears, carrying a gift so unimaginable that it shatters all the rules we thought we knew about nature and human connection. Landon Greenwood arrived at his remote cabin in late spring, hoping to escape the relentless pressures that had shadowed his life in Denver. His world had unraveled over the course of a year, the sudden loss of his job, the subsequent financial strain, and a painful breakup that left him feeling adrift. Tucked into a dense stand of pines near Glacier National Park, the cabin offered a promise of solitude, no neighbors in sight, just the towering evergreens and the distant peaks still streaked with winter snow. The real estate listing didn't exaggerate. It took a bumpy hour-long drive from the nearest town to reach the property. Once there, Landon found a modest single-story structure with peeling paint on the shutters and a lopsided front porch. Despite its flaws, the cabin radiated a sort of rough, hewn charm. It was the first place in a long time where he felt he could breathe without the claustrophobia of city life pressing in. During his first few days, Landon busied himself with repairs. He replaced warped floorboards, patched leaks in the roof, and installed new screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes that flourished near the adjacent creek. Mornings began with the faint glow of dawn as he sipped coffee on the porch, scanning the tranquil pines and marveling at the presence of deer or elk grazing in the distance. Nights ended with him propped against the ancient stone fireplace, lulled by the chirping of crickets under a sky dense with stars. Though he'd come to find peace, he was unprepared for the intense loneliness that settled in almost immediately. Days stretched long, punctuated only by the sound of wind rattling branches or the distant howl of a coyote. In Denver, he'd been surrounded by friends, colleagues, and the comforting hum of urban life. Here, the silence left him to wrestle with his own regrets. The monotony weighed on him until that fateful day when a wounded bear staggered onto his property and changed everything. He first heard a noise outside at dusk. At the time, he was organizing an old toolbox in the shed, a creaking structure he planned to renovate. A muffled groan, somewhere between a cough and a growl, floated through the pines. The short hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This was bear country, after all, and he knew enough to keep his distance if one happened to wander nearby. Yet the sound wasn't quite right, too pained, too desperate. Cautiously, Landon emerged from the shed and peered around the side of the cabin. At first, he saw nothing but tall grass swaying in the dim light. Then, a shape at the edge of the clearing caught his eye, a black bear, much larger than he'd expected, lying awkwardly against a fallen log. Its side rose and fell in ragged, uneven gasps. Even from a distance, he spotted dark streaks that looked like blood staining the once glossy fur. Fear and fascination collided in his chest. Every wildlife safety manual he'd skimmed warned against approaching a wounded animal, especially a predator. But as he backed away, his eyes locked onto the bear's gaze. There was something haunting there, a silent plea that froze him in place. He remembered losing his job, facing eviction, feeling cornered by a world that refused to cut him any slack. In the depths of the bear's injured stare, he recognized that same profound vulnerability. Rummaging in his truck, Landon found a small first aid kit. He had no illusions that it would suffice for a bear, but it was all he had. Gritting his teeth, he approached slowly, arms raised in a placating gesture. His heart hammered so hard he feared it might burst from his chest. Each step brought him closer to those massive paws and those formidable teeth. Yet the bear made no move to attack. It merely shuddered and exhaled a strained growl. The wound on the bear's flank looked nasty, likely a bullet graze. The fur was torn, and blood seeped with every breath. Landon's gut twisted. Had some careless hunter shot it? Poachers? Or maybe the bear had stumbled into the line of fire, meant for another animal. Either way, the result was the same, an infection waiting to happen. In that moment, Landon decided to disregard every official warning. Without a second thought, he retrieved a blanket from the cabin and, inch by inch, coaxed the bear away from the log. The journey was fraught with risk. One swipe from the bear's paw could end his life. Miraculously, the animal seemed too weak or too resigned to resist. He guided it toward the rickety shed, where he hastily cleared a space among old lumber and dusty boxes. He left the door ajar, fearful that locking it in might provoke panic. Landon cleaned the wound with bottled water, doused it with rubbing alcohol, and used every scrap of gauze and antibiotic cream he possessed. The bear moaned and flinched, but did not lash out. Hours later, his shirt stained with blood and sweat, Landon realized he had crossed an invisible boundary. He was now caretaker to a creature that would have been safer if left to nature's laws. That night, he barely slept, haunted by the knowledge that if the bear survived, their destinies would be interwoven in ways he could not yet imagine. In the early morning light, Landon peered out of his cabin's back window toward the shed. He had half expected the bear to vanish in the night, or, worse, destroy the flimsy structure in a confused rage. Instead, the animal remained inside, breathing shallowly. The tension in Landon's muscles eased slightly. Deciding he needed to check on the injury, he mustered the courage to approach the shed once again. He grabbed a bowl of water and a few bits of leftover, cooked chicken, the only meat he had on hand. Stepping inside, he found the bear lying against a wall of stacked boxes, the makeshift bandage still wrapped around its flank. A low rumble emanated from its throat, a warning, but not an outright threat. Landon moved slowly, placing the water bowl within the bear's reach. He placed the chicken a foot away from the bowl and retreated. The bear sniffed, then licked at the water. For a moment, a surge of relief welled in him. At least the animal had enough strength to drink. He imagined the dryness of the bear's mouth, the pain overshadowing its hunger. Then, with obvious effort, the bear pulled itself closer to the food, devouring it in a few gulps. Landon exhaled, feeling a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Landon would tend to the bear each morning and evening, offering water, scraps of leftover meat, and eventually apples and fish he managed to buy in town. Columbia Falls was a 40-minute drive away, down a series of winding roads that tested his aging truck's suspension. Each trip, he worried that while he was gone, the bear might break free, wander off, or succumb to the infection. But each time he returned to find it still there, peering at him with wary eyes. Slowly, the tension between them eased. He named the bear Shadow, although he never called it that aloud. The creature had a habit of receding into the dimmest corner of the shed, where its black fur merged with the shadows in such a way that only its amber eyes were visible. One day, those eyes held a curiosity that bordered on acceptance, an acknowledgement that Landon was not a predator, but a lifeline. Meanwhile, the spring days rolled onward, bringing fresh greenery and scattered wildflowers. Landon allowed himself cautious optimism. The bear's breathing steadied, and the worst of its fever seemed to break under his constant care and antibiotic ointments. The bullet's path had mostly grazed muscle tissue rather than vital organs, sparing the bear from a fatal injury. Still, each time he cleaned the wound, he saw the raw reminder of human violence. Despite the fragile trust forming, Landon never forgot the danger. A wild bear was not a pet. If startled, it could maim him in an instant. He took precautions, never turning his back on Shadow, never cornering the bear in the shed. If the bear seemed agitated, he'd back away and give it space. At night, he locked his cabin door and kept his hunting rifle propped by the bed, a weapon he prayed he'd never have to use. Yet as the days stretched into a week, Landon felt something shift within him. He began talking to Shadow in a soft tone, sharing little bits of his day as if they were old friends. "I saw a moose by the creek," he'd say, or "the tomatoes I planted are finally sprouting." He felt a bit foolish, but speaking to the bear filled the yawning silence that had once weighed so heavily on him. If Shadow didn't understand the words, it might at least sense the gentle intent behind them. That trust was tested one afternoon when Landon needed to change the bandage more thoroughly than usual. The wound had begun to scab over, which was good, but it also meant dried fur and caked blood that risked infection if left untouched. He entered the shed carefully, supplies in hand. The bear watched him approach, head lowered, ears slightly back. Kneeling just within reach, Landon extended the antibiotic-soaked cloth. Shadow let out a low growl, but didn't lunge. Bit by bit, Landon dabbed and trimmed away the old bandage. Shadow winced, letting out a deep grunt of pain. Landon paused, meeting its gaze. Then, as if understanding his hesitation, Shadow shifted its weight, granting him better access to the wound. The moment felt intimate, a raw exchange of trust rarely witnessed between man and beast. Landon worked quickly, finishing the procedure before the tension could fracture. When it was done, he sat back on his heels, heart racing with relief. Shadow continued to stare at him, unblinking. In the hush of that shed, Landon realized that their unspoken bond had grown deeper than he ever intended. He'd set out to save the bear's life, but in some strange twist, the bear was rescuing him. Rescuing him from isolation, from despair, and from the belief that the world was incapable of second chances. Almost 2 weeks passed. The color returned to Shadow's eyes, and the bear gained enough energy to move about the shed without collapsing. On a few occasions, Landon left the shed door wide open, hoping the bear might venture into the yard for fresh air. Each time, Shadow would amble to the threshold, sniff the breeze, then retreat inside to rest. Landon suspected the wound was still stiff enough to make traveling dangerous. Eventually, the day came when Landon discovered the shed empty. He'd awakened before dawn, intending to check on Shadow, only to find the space vacant, just a scattering of straw, a blanket soaked with dried blood, and footprints leading out into the forest. Panic hit him first, followed by a pang of sadness. Had Shadow left for good? Would it survive outside, still injured? Racing to the edge of the property, he peered into the thick pines, the underbrush so dense it was impossible to spot anything that didn't want to be found. The silence of the forest pressed in. Landon felt an unexpected ache. Over the past weeks, he'd grown accustomed to caring for the bear. Now, the abrupt departure left him unmoored. Yet a part of him recognized that this was the natural order. A wild creature didn't belong in a shed. Still, his mind buzzed with questions about whether he'd done enough. He tried to convince himself that if Shadow had walked away, perhaps it was strong enough to heal in solitude. In the days that followed, Landon resumed his routine tending the garden, fishing in the nearby creek, making occasional trips to town for supplies. He found himself searching the tree line at dusk, half hoping to see Shadow's dark silhouette. A sense of emptiness nagged at him, heightened by the knowledge that he couldn't confide this story to anyone without risking the bear's safety. The locals in town already grumbled about too many bears wandering near their properties. If word spread that Landon had fed and sheltered one, it could end badly. Then, one drizzly afternoon, Landon discovered fresh claw marks on a pine near the back porch. They were high on the trunk and looked deliberate. Nearby, the muddy ground bore enormous paw prints. His heart leapt. Shadow was still around, perhaps checking in, perhaps cautious about returning. Landon felt oddly comforted by this sign, a reassurance that the bear had not vanished forever. Even so, the nights continued to be lonely. Landon wrestled with haunting dreams, visions of losing his job, arguments with his ex, and a black bear prowling a labyrinth of office cubicles. Waking up in a cold sweat, he realized how deeply the bear's presence had infiltrated his subconscious. In a twisted way, caring for Shadow had given him something to live for, a task that required all his focus and empathy. With the bear gone, he found his old doubts creeping back, like a tide pulling in the debris of regret. His restlessness pushed him to explore more of the wilderness around the cabin. He hiked farther each day, occasionally spotting glimpses of wildlife deer bounding through meadows, a lone fox stalking prey in tall grass. Once he glimpsed a black bear in the distance, but it fled before he could get a closer look. He couldn't be sure it was Shadow, yet each new track or distant roar felt like a trail of breadcrumbs leading him deeper into the forest. In time, he reached a crossroads of sorts. Was he simply going to wait, hoping the bear might return, or was he going to move forward with his own life? One evening, after a long hike, he settled on the cabin porch, letting the last rays of sunset warm his face. He sipped a mug of tea and forced himself to consider the possibility that Shadow's chapter in his life might be over, that the bear had come into his world to spark a transformation he didn't know he needed, and then moved on, as wild creatures do. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had changed. The crippling loneliness that had once consumed him felt less like a prison and more like a quiet place where he could learn about himself. He had found a semblance of peace in nature's rhythms, a daily grounding in tasks like chopping firewood or collecting spring water from a nearby stream. The forest's soundtrack of rustling leaves and birdsong replaced the noise of city traffic and office chatter. For the first time in a long while, he didn't wake each morning dreading the day. His sense of purpose, though vague, had been rekindled. And still, a small part of him refused to believe that fate had simply left the story unfinished. The seed of a stubborn hope remained, whispering that their paths were not yet done crossing. Perhaps, in this land of pine and mountain, where life and death often intertwine in sudden, unpredictable ways, man and bear would find each other once more. Until that moment arrived, if it ever did, Landon prepared to face the wilderness and himself fully, letting the lessons of compassion, patience, and respect guide him through the unfolding seasons. Summer settled over Glacier National Park with a gentle fierceness, long days of golden light, buzzing insects, and the constant fragrance of wildflowers. Landon embraced the shift in weather, taking advantage of the mild evenings to embark on extended hikes. He ventured deeper into the backcountry, often following the winding paths that skirted streams and small waterfalls. The exercise cleared his mind, and the distant peaks reminded him how small individual struggles could be compared to the vastness of nature. Each time he went out, he carried basic first aid, a few snacks, and water. Habits developed from his experience with Shadow lingered. He remained extra cautious around thick brush, always aware that a sudden rustle might signal a bear's presence. Though black bears typically avoided humans, a surprise encounter was never out of the question. And with a little thrill of hope, he wondered if he'd ever come across Shadow again. One late afternoon, while returning from a hike near Lake McDonald, a real favorite spot among park visitors, Landon's phone buzzed, an occurrence rare enough to startle him. He had spotty reception at best. It turned out to be a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. When he pressed play, he heard a man's voice laced with anxious urgency. The message was from his younger brother, Travis, who lived in Seattle. Travis explained that their mother had fallen ill, quite suddenly, and was in the hospital. The doctors needed immediate decisions about her care, and Travis was pleading for Landon to come. A chill ran down Landon's spine. He and his mother had never been particularly close. She'd raised him, and Travis single-handedly, often working multiple jobs and leaving them to their own devices. Landon moved out at 18 and only returned for the occasional holiday. Yet the news that she was seriously ill brought a wave of guilt and responsibility crashing over him. He realized how disconnected he had been from human ties, focusing on his own quest for solitude and healing. With barely a night's rest, Landon packed a small bag, locked up the cabin, and set out on the long drive. The truck rumbled along the winding roads as he navigated the mountainous terrain leading away from his quiet sanctuary. His mind spun with questions about his mother's condition. Travis's voicemail had been short on details. Worry gnawed at him, but so did the pang of leaving behind the place that had become his refuge. Before merging onto the main highway, Landon parked by the roadside. For a moment, he let the engine idle. He stared into the wall of pines, the golden sunlight piercing through in columns. A part of him silently called out to Shadow, thanking the bear for everything it had unknowingly taught him and hoping it would stay safe until he returned. A thin pang of regret laced his thoughts. He wanted to say goodbye to the forest, to the life he was building, but in the haste, there was no time for formal farewells. The drive took him through scenic passes, across state lines, and finally into the urban sprawl of Seattle. The closer he got to the city, the heavier his chest felt. Traffic, crowds, the constant rush of modern life. He realized just how foreign it had become to him. By the time he reached the hospital, his nerves were wound tight. His mother lay in a small, sterile room, tubes and monitors around her. She looked frail, far smaller than he remembered. Travis greeted him with a mixture of relief and anxiety, explaining that their mother had a severe respiratory infection, complicated by underlying conditions. The doctors were uncertain about her prognosis, but were doing all they could. Days blurred into hospital visits, tense conversations with medical staff, and late-night coffees in waiting rooms. Though Travis and Landon had never been close, they found themselves leaning on each other. Old wounds softened under the common goal of helping their mother pull through. There was a humility in that hospital corridor, people from all walks of life, each with a story of crisis, each grappling with the fragility of existence. Throughout it all, Landon couldn't help recalling Shadow's raw vulnerability. He remembered the fear in the bear's eyes, the delicate balancing act of trust. If he'd learned anything in the cabin, it was that compassion often demanded risk, stepping beyond comfort to care for something or someone in need. Now, as he sat by his mother's bedside, wiping her forehead and speaking soft words of reassurance, he realized he was mustering the same kind of courage he'd shown in that shed. 2 tense weeks passed. His mother slowly stabilized, her body responding to antibiotics and care. Her doctors called it a minor miracle. One morning, Landon arrived early to find her awake, propped against pillows, a faint smile on her lips. In her weakened voice, she thanked him for coming. The conversation that followed was halting but honest. Apologies mingled with relief, confessions of regret overshadowed by gratitude. They both recognized time was slipping past, and they wanted to mend what they could. By the end of that week, it became clear his mother was out of immediate danger. Travis could manage the remaining details, and though she wasn't fully recovered, the urgency had passed. Landon felt the pull of his cabin once more, that small wooden place near the pines and streams that was gradually becoming home. With a promise to return for holidays, something he intended to keep, he hugged his mother and brother goodbye, then slipped behind the wheel of his faithful truck. As he left the city lights behind, relief coursed through him. Yet under that relief lay a new determination. If the bear remained near his cabin, he would do more than watch from the sidelines. He would find a way to ensure it stayed safe, thriving in a world too often marred by human carelessness. Whether that meant building better boundaries around his property or connecting with local conservationists, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that the bond forged between them ran deeper than chance. And with the turn of every mile on that road back to Montana, his heart thumped with the urgency of returning to the forest that now, more than ever, felt like his true home. When Landon finally reached his cabin, the sun was sinking low behind the towering pines. He stepped out of the truck, muscles stiff from the long drive, lungs filling with the fresh pine-scented air. Relief swept over him. So much had changed in the few weeks he'd been gone. It felt as if time worked differently here, measured in the subtle transitions of nature rather than the frantic deadlines of city life. Long grass encroached on the edges of the yard, and fresh blooms dotted the clearing, signaling late summer's vibrant peak. Landon made a quick perimeter check, relieved to see no obvious signs of vandalism. The quiet was profound, punctuated only by the drone of cicadas. Unlocking the cabin door, he stepped inside. A faint layer of dust coated the countertops, but otherwise everything seemed as he had left it, except for a set of massive paw prints tracked across the wooden porch. His pulse quickened. The prints were distinct, pressed into the thin film of dirt that had accumulated on the porch planks. They looked recent, perhaps a day or two old at most. He leaned in, comparing them mentally to the ones he'd seen before. Though not an expert tracker, he suspected they belonged to Shadow. Something about their size and spacing tugged at his memory. A swirl of excitement and concern coursed through him. Where was the bear now? Was it still wounded, or had it fully healed? He dropped his bags inside and decided to do a quick search of the immediate vicinity before dusk turned to full night. Armed with a flashlight and a small first aid kit, out of habit, more than anything he walked the perimeter of his property, following paw prints where he could. The tracks led him around the backside of the cabin, past the old shed where Shadow had once convalesced. The shed door remained slightly ajar, but it was empty except for a few scattered boxes. He noticed fresh claw marks near the doorframe, as if the bear had paused there, perhaps sniffing for signs of him. Landon's chest tightened at the thought. Had Shadow come looking for him? He wandered deeper into the stand of pines, the undergrowth crackling beneath his boots. The forest canopy created an early darkness, so he flicked on his flashlight. Within minutes, he stumbled on a small clearing where patches of moonlight illuminated the ground. As he swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, he froze. A massive shape moved at the far edge, stirring the tall grass. The shape rose onto 4 legs. Shadow. Even in the dim light, Landon recognized the bear's muscular form and the faint scar on its left flank, where the bullet had once torn through. His heart drummed in his ears. Shadow lifted its snout, sniffing the air, then turned in his direction. For a moment, man and bear locked eyes in the moonlit hush. Landon slowly lowered the flashlight beam to avoid blinding the animal. His adrenaline spiked. This was the first time they'd encountered each other on neutral ground, neither corralled into a shed nor cornered by an injury. There were no bandages, no immediate need for medical care. Just raw, unpredictable possibility. Would Shadow see him as a friend or an intruder? Compelled by a mix of longing and caution, Landon took a slow step forward, hands visible at his sides. Shadow huffed a low sound, not quite a growl. Landon froze, waiting for a cue. Rather than bolt or charge, the bear watched him intently, as if evaluating this human who had once eased its pain. In a moment of quiet resolve, Landon remembered how he'd spoken to Shadow before. His voice trembled, but was steady enough. "I'm back," he whispered, eyes never leaving the bear's silhouette. "I hope you're doing okay." He felt foolish talking to a bear in the middle of the forest, but it also felt strangely right. Shadow made no overt move. Instead, it took a cautious step closer, nose twitching. Landon's heart soared and clenched at once. This was a wild animal, yet its stance seemed curious rather than threatening. Time felt elastic, stretched between them in a silent exchange of breath, heartbeats, and memory. Eventually, Shadow ambled sideways, circling the clearing. Landon followed the bear's movement with a slow turn, staying at a respectful distance. After a few moments, as if satisfied with the inspection, Shadow turned and padded deeper into the pines, leaving Landon alone under the silver glow of the rising moon. Landon let out a shuddering exhale. Despite the raw tension of the encounter, relief and wonder swelled within him. The bear had recognized him, or at least tolerated him, and retreated without aggression. It was enough to make him grin foolishly in the dark. He realized he was trembling from the exhilaration of standing face to face with a creature that could crush him without effort, yet chose not to. He returned to the cabin with a sense of elation, excitement flickering like static through his veins. In the muted warmth of the living room, he found himself reflecting on how he and Shadow had both come a long way since that first day in the shed. The bear had reclaimed its freedom, and perhaps even a modicum of trust in humans at least. Trust in one human. Landon had learned the power of empathy, recognizing that it can bridge the gap between species, as long as respect remained the guiding principle. That night, he lay awake for hours, replaying every second of the encounter in his mind. He wondered if Shadow would return, maybe approach the cabin again. Whether or not it happened, Landon already felt a deep sense of gratitude. The bear was alive, strong, and still roamed these woods. And somehow, in the bear's quiet acceptance, Landon felt a mirror, reflecting his own sense of healing, a testament to life's capacity for renewal, even after the darkest wounds. The morning after that first reunion, Landon woke with a determined plan to learn more about the local bear population and any new regulations or sightings. While he'd previously kept a low profile in town, wary of how folks might react to his story, he now realized that staying informed could be crucial, both for Shadow's safety and his own. He drove into Columbia Falls, passing weathered barns and green fields in the bright sunlight. The main street was alive with activity, tourists in shorts and hiking boots scanning maps, locals chatting outside a diner, pickups hauling farming equipment. Landon parked near a small cafe he'd visited a few times before, drawn by its homemade pastries. After grabbing a coffee and a blueberry muffin, he wandered toward the general store, where community notices were often posted. Sure enough, a large bulletin board outside the store brimmed with flyers. Lost dog announcements, upcoming church events, a local band's gig, and various for sale items. But what caught his eye was a printed notice titled "Bear Alert." It mentioned an uptick in bear sightings near residential areas, advising homeowners to secure trash, remove bird feeders, and report any aggressive behavior to fish and wildlife. Landon frowned, reading details about property damage. The notice concluded with a reminder that feeding wildlife, bears especially, was illegal, carrying hefty fines. He felt a pang of worry. Shadow wasn't aggressive, at least from what he'd witnessed. Could the bear's presence on or near someone else's land lead to trouble? If the authorities caught wind of a problem bear, relocation or worse might follow. Tensing, Landon stepped inside the store to buy a few supplies. He overheard two older men talking loudly about a bear rummaging through somebody's garage the previous week. Another mentioned fresh sightings near a local campground. Landon's stomach lurched. The chances of it being Shadow were real. After paying for groceries and stepping outside, He nearly collided with a neighbor he recognized from a few properties over the nearest thing to a neighbor. Anyway, given they lived a couple of miles apart. Doug, a middle-aged man with a broad-rimmed hat, greeted him with a curt nod. "Heard there's a bear problem up your way, Landon," Doug said, eyes narrowed. "Folks saying it's messing around at night, flipping over trash cans and spooking livestock." He paused, studying Landon's face. "You seen anything?" Landon's mind raced. He didn't want to lie outright, but neither did he want to endanger Shadow, so he played it somewhat neutral. "I've heard a few noises in the woods, but not sure if it's the same bear," he replied carefully. Doug grunted. "Couple of ranchers are thinking of putting out deterrents. Some folks talk about traps. That's how rumors get started. Fear leads to overreaction. You be careful out there." The mere mention of traps made Landon's blood run cold. The thought of Shadow being maimed or killed by a steel trap was horrifying. He forced a polite nod, then parted ways. His mind whirled with possible steps. Should he alert the local conservation office about a wounded bear he'd helped in the past? That might bring unwanted scrutiny. Or should he keep quiet, risking that uninformed neighbors might escalate the situation? By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun hung high, beating down on the porch. He set the groceries on the kitchen counter, mind churning with dread. If Shadow was indeed venturing onto other properties or rummaging through trash, people would see it as a threat. One anonymous call to the authorities could spark a search that ended poorly for the bear. After pacing the living room, he decided to at least contact the local branch of Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks discreetly. He made a brief phone call from his porch, speaking with a ranger named Elena. Without revealing too many details, he asked about any recent incidents with bears around his area and what standard procedure might be. Elena explained that if a bear was reported as aggressive or repeatedly causing trouble, the agency often set traps to capture and relocate it. In extreme cases where a bear posed an imminent threat or was food-conditioned beyond rehabilitation, they might have to euthanize it. Hearing that possibility made Landon's chest tighten. He ended the call feeling more conflicted than ever. That evening, as dusk settled into the forest, Landon found himself standing by the old shed, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Crickets chirped, and the wind rustled the pines, but Shadow did not appear. Landon realized how precarious the situation was. The bear had a right to roam these woods, but human territory was encroaching from all sides. If it had picked up a habit of seeking out easy food from trash cans, it might inadvertently doom itself. A swirl of guilt and fear took hold. Had his own feeding during Shadow's convalescence made the bear too comfortable around humans? The last thing he wanted was to be part of the reason Shadow became a problem bear. He resolved to place his own trash in secure bear-proof containers, removing any temptation around his cabin. He also considered installing motion sensor lights or alarms that might deter Shadow from approaching. The best gift he could offer the bear was ensuring it remembered how to be wild, how to rely on nature rather than human scraps. That night, he barely slept. Every sound, every rustle, every crunch of leaves made him wonder if Shadow was prowling nearby, searching for the easy meal Landon would not provide anymore. And behind that worry lay a deeper anxiety, the knowledge that no matter how much he cared, he couldn't fully protect the bear from a world that often chose fear over coexistence. All he could do was stay vigilant, hold on to hope, and trust that Shadow's instinct to roam the deeper wilderness would keep it far from harm. Days passed in tense anticipation. Landon doubled his efforts to keep any food sources locked away. He even removed a bird feeder that hung in the yard, recalling the local wildlife agency's advice that the smallest enticement could bring in curious bears. In his heart, he yearned for another peaceful sighting of Shadow, hoping he could observe from a distance and ensure the bear was staying healthy and independent. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest took on deep shades of blue and grey, Landon sat on his porch, scanning the tree line. The air felt thick with oncoming rain clouds gathered, and lightning occasionally flickered in the distance. Despite the threat of a storm, the night was quiet, the stillness broken only by a faint rumble of thunder. Then a shape materialized at the edge of the clearing. Landon squinted, heart leaping. A massive black bear emerged from the pines, limping slightly but not from any fresh wound. He recognized that familiar left flank, the old scar partially covered by sleek summer fur. It was Shadow. Landon swallowed hard, exhilaration and dread mingling as the bear lumbered closer. Head bent low as if carrying something. Rain began to spatter the ground, the wind picking up. Lightning asked across the sky, illuminating the clearing with a ghostly brightness. In that flash, Landon saw something clenched in Shadow's jaws, a small object, vague in shape. His mind raced. Was it food? Something else? He rose from his chair, stepping carefully down from the porch. The hair on his arms prickled with electricity from the storm's approach. Shadow advanced to within 10 feet of the porch, water dripping from its fur. Landon's pulse hammered. Any sudden movement might spook or provoke the bear, yet he felt an inexplicable pull to see what Shadow carried. The bear lowered its head, dropping a dirt-covered bundle on the wet grass. Thunder rumbled louder, and a gust of wind sent droplets stinging against Landon's face. He stood transfixed as Shadow nudged the object forward with its nose, then backed away a step. Landon hesitated, every instinct warning him about approaching a large predator's find. Yet Shadow showed no aggression. Its posture seemed almost offering. Slowly, with hands raised, Landon inched closer. Lightning flashed again, revealing the soggy, mud-caked shape. He crouched down. A shock coursed through him. It looked like a small wooden carving, battered and worn, depicting a bear standing upright. The crude craftsmanship suggested a handmade piece, possibly lost by a camper or left behind at a campsite. He reached out gingerly, picking up the carving. Shadow watched, its dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. Water dripped from the small wooden figurine, forming muddy rivulets down his wrist. Landon's mind raced with disbelief. Had Shadow found this object in the forest and brought it here? Why? In that surreal moment, thunder crashed overhead, and rain began to pour, soaking both man and bear. Landon stood, meeting Shadow's gaze. The carving felt strangely warm in his hand, despite the cold rain. Emotions welled up: astonishment, gratitude, a fierce protectiveness. He struggled to form words, his voice lost in the roar of the storm. Still, he murmured a soft, shaky thank you, half laughing at the impossibility of it all. For a few heartbeats, they remained locked in the downpour, two silhouettes bound by the shared memory of a wound once tended and a trust painstakingly built. Then, as if satisfied, Shadow turned and lumbered back into the pines, the storm swallowing its form until only darkness remained. Landon stood in the clearing, water dripping from his hair, the wooden carving clutched in his palm like a lifeline to some larger mystery. Even after the bear was gone, Landon lingered. He rubbed away some of the mud, revealing faint details of the carving: a bear's rounded ears, a small snout, tiny carved eyes. The significance overwhelmed him. A wild animal had carried this artifact from who knew where, risking its own comfort during a storm to bring it here. It felt like a gesture of recognition, maybe gratitude, or something deeper that neither man nor beast could fully comprehend. Drenched and trembling, Landon finally retreated indoors, the carving still in hand. He peeled off his soaked clothes, toweled himself dry, and lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. As he warmed up, He examined the figurine by the flickering light. The underside bore initial scratches, too worn to decipher. But the shape was unmistakable. A bear standing in quiet majesty. The tooth marks, marring its surface, told a story of a journey across the forest floor, carried in powerful jaws that could crush yet chose to protect. As night stretched on, Landon gazed at the carving, heart brimming with wonder. The gift was shocking because it defied logic, an animal of instinct, bridging a gap no one would have believed possible. It validated the notion that compassion leaves an echo, one that can resurface when least expected. At some point past midnight, he set the carving on the mantel, letting it dry in the dancing glow of the fire. He fell asleep in his armchair soon after, lulled by the crackle of flames and the lingering awe of a moment that transcended every barrier he'd ever known. In the days after receiving the wooden carving, Landon moved through life in a near-reverent state. He tended to mundane chores, collecting firewood, stocking up on canned goods, cleaning the cabin as though each task was imbued with deeper meaning. The figurine rested on his mantel, a silent testament to the inexplicable bond he shared with Shadow. News of bear sightings continued to spread around Columbia Falls, but there were fewer panicked voices now that high summer provided ample forage in the mountains. Wild berries and fish were in abundance, reducing the likelihood of bears scavenging trash. Still, Landon couldn't shake his apprehension. One wrong interaction with a frightened property owner could seal Shadow's fate. Yet, ironically, he also felt a sense of peace. Something about that stormy night told him their story was reaching a new equilibrium. One weekend, he ventured to the local library in Kalispell, larger than the tiny library in Columbia Falls, searching for any records or legends of bears offering tokens to humans. It felt like a stretch, but he wanted answers, or at least a historical context for such an event. Flipping through books on Native American folklore, he found scattered references to bears as guardians or guides, but no definitive story matching his experience. Still, reading about the reverence many cultures hold for bears deepened his sense that their meeting was part of an ancient dialogue. He also stumbled upon a volunteer program for wildlife rehabilitation, an opportunity to help local fauna recover from injuries before returning to the wild. The brochure described everything from caring for orphaned fawns to releasing rehabilitated owls. Landon felt a tug in his chest. For months, he'd been adrift, living in seclusion to heal his own wounds. Now, the seed of an idea planted itself. Perhaps he could channel the empathy awakened by his bond with Shadow into actively protecting other animals. Returning home, he called the number listed, explaining his interest in volunteering. The coordinator, an enthusiastic woman named Erica, asked him a flurry of questions. He hesitated to share the full story of Shadow, offering instead a vague summary of once nursing an injured wild animal. Erica sounded intrigued, telling him that the program always needed capable hands, especially those with practical experience. They arranged a meeting for the following week. Though nervous about returning to a world of schedules and obligations, Landon felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. His mother's health scare, his reconnection with his brother, and his experiences with Shadow had gradually shown him that re-entering society didn't have to mean losing the peace he'd found. He could live at the cabin, volunteer in a role that resonated with his newfound passion, and still walk in the forest at dusk, scanning for any sign of the black bear that had forever altered his life. Before the meeting, he wandered to the mantel and gently lifted the wooden figurine. Tracing his finger over the tooth marks, he thought about how this small object symbolized resilience, trust, and the uncanny ways fate can entwine lives. He tucked the carving into his bag, deciding to keep it with him as a talisman, an emblem of the bond that set him on this path. On the day of his appointment, he made the hour-long drive to the Wildlife Center, a modest compound of buildings near a stretch of protected land. Erica greeted him warmly, introducing him to a few staff members and giving him a brief tour. He saw enclosures where injured raptors regained their strength, a small stable for rescued deer, and a quarantine area for animals that needed isolation. The center's mission resonated with him, helping creatures that couldn't help themselves, giving them a second chance at life in the wild. By the end of the day, Erica offered him a volunteer position on weekends to start, with the possibility of expanding later. Landon accepted eagerly. As he drove back through rolling fields and winding roads toward his cabin, he caught himself humming a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The uncertainty of the future no longer felt suffocating. It felt open and alive. When he reached home, twilight was settling. He placed the carving back on the mantel, the last rays of sunlight dancing on its worn surface. Gazing out the window at the forest, he whispered a silent thank you to Shadow, to the land, and to the improbable twist of fate that had led him here. He remembered how he once saw the woods as an escape from human failure, a place to hide. Now, he understood it as a place of healing, a realm that had tested him, taught him, and perhaps rewarded him with an unspoken blessing. He had no guarantee he'd see Shadow again, but he held on to hope, trusting that the same destiny that drew them together in crisis might, on some quiet evening, allow their paths to cross again, no longer as wounded patient and reluctant savior, but as two beings who recognized something kindred in each other, forging a connection that spanned the wild and the human heart alike. Thank you for accompanying me on this unforgettable journey, where a single act of compassion bridged the gap between man and bear, culminating in a gift that defied every expectation. If you found this story moving, please take a moment to like the video and share it with friends who might be inspired by a tale of resilience and unlikely friendship. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that explore the profound connections we share with the natural world and with one another. Your support helps these narratives reach more people, sparking conversations about empathy and our bond with wildlife. Together, we can spread awareness of how small acts of kindness, even across species boundaries, can ripple outward, transforming both individuals and the environments we call home. Thank you for watching, and keep exploring the beauty and mystery that await just beyond our doorstep.